Hi, guys. So, Christopher Hitchens was one of the greatest minds of the late 20th and early 21st century. Now, he had a few blind spots. I disagreed with him on a number of issues, but I do believe he was one of the greatest thinkers we had. And unfortunately, we lost him some years ago. Now, he has a brother, Peter Hitchens, who's attempting to live within his brother's shadow. He doesn't really come up to the same standard as Christopher did. But especially when it comes to this pandemic, he seems to have fallen in with the right, in a sense, in the way that they just don't want to have any lockdowns. They don't want to deal with this problem, and they don't actually have any solutions. So let's actually hear what he had to say about Wales and the pandemic.
There's no relation between the political Johnson to the journalist Johnson at all.
No. Let's move on to the position in Wales. I'd like to present you with a little fantasy, a little scenario. If I could put you into a locked room for 5 or 10 minutes with Mr. Drakesford, the First Minister of Wales, what would you say to him?
Well, I'd say to him what I say to all the proponents of this stuff is your action proportionate to the problem? Have you actually studied it, or have you been stampeded by fear? And by fear of responsibility into doing something you never ought to have done, and oughtn't you to admit that a mistake's been made? Because this has been what I've been saying actually since March the 14th in my column in the Mail on Sunday. We've got this out of proportion. Yes, there's a problem. Yes, COVID-19 kills people. Yes, that's very sad, but it's not as big a problem as we stated it is. And the actions...
Okay, so what would you have done as an alternative? See, it's very easy to stand on the sidelines and say, look, the lockdown is wrong. These measures are wrong. You shouldn't be doing this. Okay, what would you present as an alternative to doing a lockdown?
Being proposed against it have not been effective. There's a tremendous piece, which absolutely earth-shaking, actually, by Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator, on his blog currently, which I urge everybody to read, showing definitively that the idea that the National Health Service was about to be overwhelmed in March and April of this year is completely provably false. The statistics.
Okay. So the scientists had told Boris Johnson, if we don't impose a lockdown, the healthcare service, the NHS, will be overwhelmed. Boris Johnson imposed a lockdown, and the NHS was not overwhelmed. And you see this as evidence that the lockdown didn't work. I've heard this argument before. Look, the scientists said that the NHS would be overwhelmed. The NHS was not overwhelmed. See? See, they were wrong. The scientists were wrong. No, the scientists predicted that if you don't do a lockdown, if you don't impose some sort of restrictions, the NHS will be overwhelmed. The purpose of the lockdown was twofold. Was to protect the NHS from being overwhelmed, and was to, well, it should have been this, but it didn't actually turn out to be this, but it should have been to get the numbers down so that a test and trace mechanism can work. That you can implement test, trace, and isolate. That's what should have happened. Now, because that didn't happen, because the lockdown wasn't severe enough, wasn't strict enough, wasn't long enough, that's why you're starting to see cases rise again. And the test and trace mechanism to deal with that was, of course, underfunded. Was not just underfunded, but it was handed off to people like Serco, who have no competence, no history of dealing with this, instead of actually getting the NHS to deal with it. Once again, you have to remember, there's so many political strings being pulled here. For example, Boris Johnson giving the responsibility of test and trace to a private company that has connections to the Conservative Party in the middle of a pandemic. You know, imagine you're in a war and you say, look, we're under attack. We need weapons. And instead of actually asking weapons companies to produce weapons, you actually ask a company that produces, I don't know, dustbins. I want you to prepare weapons because you have connections to the government, and we want to give you this contract. In the middle of a war, what would people think if that was the case? not a perfect analogy, I know, but look, the lockdown didn't work because it wasn't a true lockdown. Test and trace didn't work because it wasn't funded correctly and it was handed off to a private company who had no history in dealing with test and trace. What should have taken place was a severe lockdown for the time required to get numbers down to as close to zero as possible. Implement test, trace, and isolate. Test people. As soon as new cases start to appear, trace their contacts and isolate all of those people. The original case, the first case, and those connected with it. That's what the tracing should have done. Now, you can isolate people at home, but I think it's better, like what they did in South Korea, was to isolate people in particular facilities. The government would provide them food, resources, whatever they need. Allow them contact with their family via Skype or Zoom or whatever for the time required. Continually test them while they're in that place. And then as soon as they test negative, a number of times, then they're released back to their homes. I know it sounds draconian, but it worked. What we did in Europe was we were afraid to be severe, and we did half-arsed measures instead. And now you have people on the right, like Peter Hitchens, who are saying, see, look, it didn't work. Your half-arsed measure didn't work because we wanted you to do half-arsed measure. Actually, we didn't want you to do anything. But you did a half-arsed measure and it didn't work.
Show that it simply was not so. What we also know is that there's no evidence whatsoever that the shutdowns which have been imposed have actually halted or slowed the spread of the disease in any means.
First of all, there's a lag. So if you impose a restriction today, you're not going to see a result tomorrow. Once again, I'm very critical of these types of tier systems because they're not going to do enough of a job. Now, I think it's still early to see the results. You can't write them off completely. They will, I think, suppress the spread a little or somewhat, but not to the level that we need. Once again, we need to get it down as close as possible to zero so that test and trace and isolate can work. Why is this so difficult to understand? I understand people are pretending not to understand for political reasons. But that's what the scientists have been telling us since the beginning. We have decided not to follow the science. We can't blame the scientists at this stage. They told us this is what we needed to do. We did a half-arsed measure, and now we're seeing the consequences.
Meaningful way. But the costs, the measurable costs of this to the economy, to small business, to employment, to the gigantic government debt, which I promise you we will all have to pay in some way eventually, have been measurably enormous. And it's a simple loss, lack of proportion, and also a panic and an unwillingness to admit a mistake. And I think we should forgive people who admit mistakes.
Yeah, I agree.
But I assume you didn't vote for the Conservative Party, because if you did, then I don't know why you're expecting them to admit mistakes. They don't admit mistakes. They have never admitted mistakes. It's always someone else's fault. Okay? Be it Brexit, be it this pandemic, be it free school meals. It's always someone else's mistake. It's always someone else's responsibility. So don't be expecting them to admit mistakes, and Boris Johnson to admit that he's sorry, that he did something wrong.
Only up to a point. I think the moment has come where those politicians who continue to cling to this failed prescription for a grossly exaggerated problem have now reached the point where their refusal to consider a very serious scientific opposition to what they're doing.
Okay, well, once again, everything is wrong. Everything is wrong. But what are you suggesting instead, Peter? Please tell us, Peter, what would you do if you were the Prime Minister? What would you do if you were in charge of SAGE or in charge of this pandemic response?
As well as political opposition, it has reached the point where they really do need to be removed from office. call democratic opportunity. And that in the time between that now and their removal, they have to admit that their mistake and have to start putting.
Well, yes, dream on, Peter, dream on. Listen, I have to be honest. I came to lockdown skepticism a little bit later than you. I don't think for me the light bulb went on until about June, and it's been getting brighter and brighter ever since, because it's so obvious that back in March when we had the initial lockdown, I supported it. I bought the line that we had to protect the NHS and save lives and all of that. And to some extent, I still do back then, with hindsight. But we knew nothing about the virus then, very little. We didn't know which were the target groups, which were the vulnerable groups, which was the great majority that wasn't going to be seriously affected by it. We didn't know any of that. So we had a blunderbuss.
Can I dispute some of what you've said? What the thing was, there were indeed a lot of things that we did not know. Mm-hmm. We didn't know really the case fatality rate and things like that, but exaggerations were being put about, which were easily dispelled. And the work of Professor John Ioannidis of Stanford, for instance, made it clear that there was a strong possibility we were overestimating the danger and also overestimating the widespread nature of the effect of the disease.
So we should have done less? Is that what you're suggesting? He's not being very clear here. Now, I don't know why he's not being clear. He could come out and just say, we should have done nothing. But he's not doing that. Why is he not doing that? Is it because he doesn't want to be ridiculed later on? You know, it's very easy to stand on the sidelines and criticize, but it's much more difficult to actually present something. I'm actually being more honest than Peter Hitchens here, because I'm laying my cards on the table. We need to have a lockdown. I understand that that's not very popular. It's easier for me, of course, because I'm not a public figure. I'm not a politician. We need to impose a lockdown. Now, that doesn't mean that we throw everyone under a bus. We need to protect businesses. We need to protect individuals financially. We need to change our society. This is an opportunity to create a better society. You know, be it war, be it a plague, many things come along that change our society. The people who want to go back generally are not successful. The people who say we need to go forward, we need to adapt, they generally are generally the ones who change society for the better. I'm not sure if I'm making a lot of sense here. But what I mean is, we can't go back. People like Peter Hitchens and the commentator here want to go back to the way things were. We're not going back. Even if we have a vaccine, even if we eliminate this virus tomorrow, we're not going back. Too many things have changed. And I'm not even talking about the pandemic. I'm talking about business. Many people are now working from home. People have adapted to that. Businesses, in many cases, would prefer people to work from home. It's cheaper for them. They're able to control people in a better way, in a positive and negative sense. Things have changed. We're not going back. We're not going to fill offices again. We have skyscrapers that are empty. Maybe it was a bad idea to build skyscrapers in the first place. Perhaps, I think, cities of the future will not perhaps have skyscrapers. We're going to have, you know, in the past we predicted, you know, concentrated cities. Maybe that's not going to be the future. This pandemic has shifted everything. Now we can adapt to that. We can try and move forward, or we can be like Peter Hitchens and try to turn the clock back.
There was nothing that I wrote in March that you couldn't have written or said as well from looking to see what was going on.
All right, be that as it may. Okay, I take your point, but let's just move it on, because I'll put this question to you. We've learned so much more about the way the virus behaves, as I said, who's at risk and who's not at risk, and we have much more intelligence now. If we were fighting a war, you would call it a massing of intelligence across the desk. So why are we still playing hide and seek? Because that was my analogy when the light bulb went on. We're playing hide and seek with the virus, with lockdown. lockdown. We go and hide in the wardrobe, we dive under the covers, and when we come out, surprise, surprise, it's still there, and it gets us again, and cases go up, and we have to dive under the covers again, and it's ridiculous. And a way to make us do that, it's not just that the government is in a state of panic, and has been since Professor Ferguson's ludicrous model back in March. It's also the case that they're spinning the panic. And I said this earlier on the programme, I've written about this in my column.
Okay, but I would really, and I'm not trying to be disingenuous here, but I would really like to hear what this guy on the left and Peter Hitchens would suggest we do. What would you suggest we do? These people never have any response. They just say, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. Okay, what would you do? I'm not going to tell you. They will never tell you what we should do instead. Or if they do, it's like, do nothing. You know, they will admit that there is a problem, but their solution, if you can get a solution out of them, is to do nothing. Or it's to, well, we can just lock old people and the sick away. Because the young people are part of the economy. We need wage slaves to continue the economy. You have to understand that the people who are deciding that you should go back to work, that everything is okay, are people who are losing money, people who are in very wealthy positions, who are losing money. They don't care about you. They don't care about the pandemic. They don't care about poverty. They pretend to. They say, look, many people are suffering financially. They're worried about themselves because their businesses are losing money. They have investments in businesses and they're seeing their portfolios decrease because of the pandemic. And that's why they want people to get back into work. That's why they want people to get back into city centres and restart the economy. It's not about the people, it's about them. The sooner we wake up and understand this, the people who are telling you that there is no problem have an agenda. And it's not to look after people, it's about looking after themselves financially. I'm telling you we need to do a lockdown. A lockdown doesn't help me in any way, but I'm looking at the science. The scientists are saying we need to impose a lockdown. We can see other countries like, once again, South Korea, who didn't actually need a lockdown because they had the right measures put in place from the beginning, even before the beginning of this pandemic in their country. I talked about this before. They did the right thing. We did the wrong thing. And now we're continuing to do the wrong thing. And we have people on the right saying we should be doing nothing, basically. I'm quite disappointed with Peter Hitchens. I'm quite sad that his brother isn't still around. I think his brother would have been able to have some better insight into this. But unfortunately, this is all a hypothetical. Let me know in the comment section, guys, what you think. As always, your comments are greatly appreciated. Thanks a lot. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons. You ensure that this channel continues to exist. I'm eternally grateful for all of your support. If you join Patreon, you will receive instant access to our Discord server, where we have both audio and video chats. You can chat with me and other patrons, where we discuss important and non-important issues. Becoming a patron per month costs about the same as a large coffee. So why not check it out?